they date from the Pliocene, like a couple of million years ago, up into the late Pleistocene. So we're talking, they lived for millions of years and through a lot of different kinds of climates, and then suddenly disappeared.
Okay. And so what about pterodactyls? You mentioned before about how if all dinosaurs had feathers, then shouldn't we, contrary to how we were, told as children, that shouldn't we imagine that pterodactyls also were feathered?
Pterodactyls or pterosaurs are a completely different group from most of the dinosaurs that we think about.
Okay.
So they were, I do not know if they were feathered or not, but it's entirely possible that they were not.
Why would they have not been feathered if they flew anyway? Wouldn't feathers be a natural way to help guide their flight?
Well, let me think about this. Pterosaurs, what we can tell from their skeletons, and I am no expert on pterosaurs, is that they didn't do much powered flying. They did a lot of gliding. They don't have the big keel that birds have on, the thing that all that breast muscle is attached to on chickens. So there's a reason they have these huge pecs. And it's because you need a lot of power to be able to do powered flight, to be able to take off from just a standing position, leap into the air, and fly away. Right. Pterosaurs mostly seem to need to leap from something, or maybe make use of like an air current that you could run down a slope and open your wings out and fly. I mean, the largest pterosaurs had wingspans of like 60 feet.
Wow.
They were huge.
Okay. And so, but how did they get to the place where they could run off and then use updrafts to carry them into the sky?
They might have just sort of clambered awkwardly around. I mean,
really?
On sea coasts, there's often a sea wind. There are places where there are predictable strong winds all the time, and maybe these are the places that they like. Again, this is getting well out of my
I know
knowledge, so I don't want to say something really stupid.
No, and I get that. And I appreciate you going there with me, but it's where my curiosity kept going while I was reading your book, especially when you were talking about the research of Julia Clark.
Yes. Julia is a paleontologist at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's really interested in the origins of modern birds and that transition, that time between the end of the Cretaceous and then the beginning of the Paleogene. And how animals survived through that time, what they were like before it, what they were like after it. Also things like, what did their feathers look like? How did they make sounds? And what kinds of sounds did they make? Birds have evolved their own unique vocal organ, which is different from other reptiles. It's different from mammals. We all have a larynx, which is an older kind of vocal organ. But birds made their own new one called a pharynx. And bird pharynxes are really interesting. They're the things that allow songbirds to make all these incredible sounds. Some birds can make more than one sound at a time, in an incredible range of frequencies. They can also use other ways of making sounds that don't use the pharynx, like the cooing of pigeons, which is sort of like they're using they're just blowing air through their entire esophagus all at once. And some birds can use techniques like that to make really deep kind of type sounds that carry a really long way. So that's the kind of thing that Julia researches. And when we see her in the book, I went with her and some of her students and colleagues to a place in southern Chile where there are fossil deposits that go right up to the end of the Cretaceous. So we were looking for birds that were alive in that time to try to understand better what it was like, not just at that time, but at that place in the world at that time, because that's an area of the world about which we know very little, but it was connected to Antarctica.
And that's another interesting aspect of the book is how long did it take before, say, a penguin or a whale could circumnavigate Antarctica, because the bridges that had linked it at one point when it was still a jungled landmass to Australia or to South America hadn't yet disappeared.
That's right. It's about 30 million years go by between the Cretaceous extinctions and the collapse of the last bridge to South America, which opens, they call the Drake Passage, because Francis Drake got blown backwards through it by accident. back in the 16th century. But the opening of that gap made it possible for this thing called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current to exist, which is this belt of ocean that circles Antarctica, and it's almost like a moat. It keeps out warmer water from the north, and it started cooling down the entire continent. So Antarctica starts to freeze at that point. Nonetheless, there are still forests in Antarctica in some places, at least up until as recently as like 3 million years ago.
That's still fascinating. And there's there's so much ice covering that there's no easy way to get to it.
To get underneath the ice?
Yeah, to get to the jungles, the frozen forests underneath.
Yeah, I mean, pieces of them have been found. Or that the pieces, fossil evidence is there that these species of trees, which you can still see today in places like Tasmania or southern Argentina or New Zealand. Like there are trees there that once thrived in Antarctica. All these southern land masses were once connected in this big supercontinent called Gondwana, and that these trees are referred to as Gondwanan forests, Gondwanan flora.
And
after that, go ahead.
No, I did say, and Julia Clark, while you were with her, Julia Clark was looking specifically for what? What was she hoping to find? What's the ultimate goal? What's the holy grail of her research?
Well, I mean, Julia wants to know more about what life was, among her many research goals, about what life was like for these flying feathered dinosaurs that that gave rise to the birds that we have now.
Okay.
And so she does that both by studying living dinosaurs, essentially, and also by looking at them in the past and drawing parallels between them. So this was a place that we went to where it was possible that you might find fossils of these animals, because lots of different dinosaur fossils have been found in this place.
Okay, well, hang on to that thought right there, because we're coming up on the break, and I don't want to interrupt that thought. So we'll pick up there, and I'll get my last few questions coming up next, and then we'll open up the phones for you on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett.
From the Kfi 24-hour newsroom, the airline industry has passed a milestone as more COVID-19 restrictions are relaxed. More than 2 million people streamed through airport security checkpoints Friday for the first time since early March 2020. The TSA says there's been a steady increase in airline travelers since February as more Americans got vaccinated against the coronavirus and travel restrictions, including mandatory quarantines, have been lifted. President Biden and other world leaders have wrapped up Day 2 of the G7 summit in Cornwall, England. ABC's Karen Travers says the group plans to move forward with a worldwide infrastructure initiative.
It's meant to be an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a global development project that has China pouring money into developing countries worldwide for infrastructure projects.
The G7 proposal will be called Build Back Better for the World, putting a global spin on the President Biden's domestic infrastructure and jobs slogan. SoCal weather from KFI. Lows in the 60s in the IE, up to 100 in the afternoon. We lead local from the KFI 24-hour newsroom. I'm Brian Bruman.
Checking KFI traffic, we do have a full closure still in effect in the Fountain Valley area. 405 north from Brookhurst to Warner. All lanes closed until 8:30 a.m. Due Sylmar on the 210 eastbound between the 5 and Roxford. All lanes shut down until 5 a.m. Monday. And through Corona on the 91 westbound at Green River. 2-car wreck there has the right lane blocked. In the Sylmar area, 5 northbound to 210, crash here has the center lane blocked. KFI in the Sky helps get you there faster. I'm Jonathan Weiss.
9 out of 10 doctors say their patients have asked about health benefits of CBD. That clearly suggests how CBD has become an essential part of health and awareness. And in honor of National CBD Awareness Day, CBDistillery.com, America's most trusted name in CBD, is announcing their biggest sale of the year. Studies show that CBD interacts with your body's regulatory system responsible for sleep, emotional response, inflammation, and memory. So better sleep, more calm and relief from discomfort after physical activity sounds good, you should explore CBD. With over 2 million customers and 100% money-back guarantee, CB Distillery is the source to trust. Visit cbdistillery.com and enter the promo code CBD30 for your huge National CBD Awareness Day discount. Again, CBD30 at cbdistillery.com. CBD30 at cbdistillery.com.
We all have wished at one time or another if we could just do two things at the same time. Well, if you're about to refinance or purchase a new home, here are two things you should absolutely do at the same time. Apply with at least two lenders. Mark Tice here from HMS Capital. Having two loans processed at the same time accomplishes a couple of important things. First, it maintains continuing competition for you, the customer, right up to the finish line. This results in a lower interest rate that saves you money. Second, it improves your chances of a successful transaction by eliminating the dependence on a single lender. HMS Capital requires no advance fees to apply, there's no appraisal fee, and no credit fee. With our razor-sharp interest rates, we are completely confident that no matter how many lenders you apply with, we will win your business. So call HMS Capital today and let us show you how doing two things at once really can save you money. Call HMS Capital at 833-255-5698. 833-255-5698. That's 833-255-5698. Or go to hmscapital.com.
HMS Capital Funding is a DBA of Golden Empire Inc. MNLS ID number 2427. HMS Capital is licensed by the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation under the California Residential Mortgage Lending Act. License number 4130360. Equal housing lender.
In 1975, my family lived under the boot of communist Russia. Hello, I'm John Akoyan, owner of Rooter Hero Plumbing. Communism was so oppressive that my dad, who didn't speak a word of English, left everything behind and immigrated us to America. I was only 3 years old. I can't imagine the courage it took to do that. My father put us first, and at Rooter Hero Plumbing, we put you first. That's why we always offer you an affordable solution. If you have a clogged drain, call us at 866-DRAIN-77, and we'll cable your line for only $77. That's 866-DRAIN-77. Thank you for trusting Rooter Hero Plumbing with your most valuable asset, your home. I miss my dad, but his sacrifice will never be forgotten. Happy Father's Day.
Everybody needs a hero. RooterHero.com.
CL 102-8886.
Getting families vaccinated against COVID-19 is an important step to bringing back joy for all of us. That's within reach now that the Pfizer vaccine is proven safe and effective for those 12 and older. This is the same vaccine millions of Californians have already gotten. California is even adding new vaccine clinics specifically for young people. Together, we can end the pandemic. Visit vaccinateall58.com or call 833-422-4255 to learn more.
KFI AM 640, more stimulating talk.
Premier Networks presents Coast to Coast AM with Ian Punnett. Now, here's Ian.
I think you got it, right? The birds, yardbirds, eagles, the partridge family, who am I? The fabulous Thunderbirds. You got the theme for the bumpers tonight. Bands named after birds. Although I could have done a whole thing on, music from the 60s and 70s featuring the harpsichord, because the Partridge Family solo with the harpsichord in I Think I Love You may be the greatest of all time. Second, coming in a close second for your Love by the Yardbirds. But let's face it, Lori Partridge could shred it, right? We all agree. So then we'll pick up. Julia Clark is a woman that our guest Jonathan Meiberg focuses on in his book, A Most Remarkable Creature. And I wanted to give him a chance to wrap up on her research and then get my last few questions in before we get to your calls coming up on the way on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett.
It may be the biggest cover-up ever. Was the coronavirus created in a Chinese lab? Watch Cortez and Pellegrino tonight on Newsmax as they tell the real story. More than 30 million Americans watch Newsmax on all the major cable systems, or download the free Newsmax app on your smartphone and start watching now. Millions of Americans are turning off the old cable news and going to Newsmax for real news that they can trust. Check out Newsmax today. It's one of the greatest. I watch it all the time. Newsmax.com, Newsmax TV.
Now you can get generic Viagra shipped to your door for about $2 a pill. Get the same impact for less. Call Steelman Pills now and get the same blue pill for about $2 a pill. Call now for the 50 pill special and save even more. Plus, get a free bonus. 800-847-1077. 800-847-1077. 800-847-1077. 800-847-1077.
Real people, real stories.
I have suffered for years and years, and it was one of those things that I was just willing to try most anything, and so I ordered the carnivora. I had acute eczema and hives. I had been to minimum of 3 different dermatologists. They always gave me another cream or another ointment to put on that was supposed to help relieve the itching. I have tried every cream and ointment that you can imagine. I promise you it was pretty miserable. So I started taking the carnivora, and at this point, I don't want to ever be without it. I want to go back there again.
Call 866-836-8735. That's 866-836-8735. Or visit carnivora.com. That's carnivora.com.
I do coast to coast live from a very darkened room, usually just the light of my laptop. And the only other thing that's lit up in this room is a misguided lightning bug that somehow made its way into the studio, and it's just flying around my head, adding a kind of ambience to this conversation, which I am loving. We're talking about the prehistoric birds, and we're talking about them within a context of both the things which we know and the things that we're still learning. These would be the species that survived the Cretaceous meteor, and then in one way or another changed. So we say species, I would put that in quotes because, it was millions of years ago, and they changed in many different ways. But that's what Jonathan Myberg has been interested in, is this particular bird that he found, that he encountered on one of the smaller Falkland Islands, and that is the center point of the book, A Most Remarkable Creature. But along the way, we talk a lot about how smart raptors are. So that brings us back to a woman that he interviewed while he was doing the book, and she's a chapter in there about what her research is. And so you were saying about Julia Clark, and then we ran into the bottom of the hour.
Yeah, and actually, I want to backtrack because what I was afraid of happening is exactly what happened, which is I told you a bunch of lies about pterosaurs.
I knew you were going to do that because I was really forcing you to go into an area that you were not prepared for, so that is not your fault. But go ahead, clear that up.
Anybody, I recommend anybody who wants to know more about pterosaurs, go and look online, look at Wikipedia or other references. But in answer to your question about did they have feathers, it looks like they had coats of hair-like filaments called pycnofibers, which might be a little like down feathers you find on birds.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
But they would have had smooth or fluffy coats that did not resemble birds' feathers.
So like baby penguins.
Maybe so. Penguins are funny. Most birds have feathers attached only at certain zones in their body. Like if you've ever plucked a chicken, you know this quite well, that the feathers aren't attached all over. They cover the bird's whole body, but they don't grow out of every part of it, except with penguins, where it's almost as if they have fur. There are feathers coming out of every single part of their body, and they're so tightly packed with these long feather shafts that it's like a beautiful, fluffy coat of fur. They're just amazing.
Right. With the fat is what allows them to swim in those icy waters, right?
Oh yeah, I've seen them standing out on a freezing cold day, just standing in the sun and panting because they're so hot.
They're so hot. That's so funny.
Really amazing.
All right, so at least some of the pterosaurs had that type of that sort of baby feather type, some sort of micro feather kind of thing that was going on.
Yeah, it's sort of like an early version of that, and that it's just the early feathers evolved in the common ancestor to pterosaurs and all the other dinosaurs, possibly as insulation.
It doesn't sound like they would look attractive by our modern aesthetic.
They'd be pretty weird. I mean, it says also in here that they walked on land. They could walk on all four limbs with an upright posture. They could take off from the ground. There were a great variety of them. They weren't all huge. Some of them were tiny. In fact, the older ones were tiny, and the really big ones only started to appear later in time. They ate all kinds of stuff. They may have lived in the trees. This is a place where there's been a great advance in our understanding of what this group was like.
But everything you just said right there, so walking on all fours, right, leaning forward on the wings and the kind of the knuckles of the wings, if you will.
Because the wings are mostly attached to, like, if you imagine your index finger, like your fourth finger, imagine that was as long as the rest of your body, and then you have this membrane that attached from your feet up to the tip of this finger, and then you could fly around using it. It'd be like that.
Well, and then you made the point earlier, though, that they didn't have those giant breast muscles that we would associate with modern birds, right? So,
no, but it says here in what I'm reading here that they were quite strong and that some of them were able to take off from the ground in different ways. So I just don't want to go any further with
No, that's good.
Information about pterosaurs.
No, but I want to draw a parallel. The way you were describing that sounds a lot like the bats that I see in my neighborhood, right?
Yeah,
but I remember asking my dad, who was hardly an expert on this at the time, but I remember he was very clear that bats are not related to like a pterodactyl, even though they would walk the same or look the same and had kind of fleshy wings. They were not related, right?
It's funny. When we say something isn't related to something else, we never mean it in an absolute sense because all life on Earth that we know of has a single common ancestor. So when we say something isn't related, it's only in relative terms.
Okay, well, then you and I are related. I mean, I get that. I mean, we are, right?
Well, me and that oak tree out there are related.
Right.
In the exact same way that I'm related to my grandmother. It's just a difference of degree.
Right. And by the way, I am related to the guy who invented Punnett squares.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. And closer, perhaps, than you and I. We actually
had my existence in high school.
Me too. And there was a lot of pressure on me to do Punnett squares well. And I was like, it's just not my thing. And they were like, and people were like, these are easy. And I'm like, well, good. Reginald Crundle Punnett would be very proud of you, and he'd be ashamed of his whatever I am to his in the ancestral link. But that's where it's really kind of interesting where, but bats, I think, again, when we look at them, if you feel like you can talk about this a little bit, I am kind of curious, because they look prehistoric, whereas a blue jay doesn't look like it could be ever tied to anything that was at one point a dinosaur. Bats do.
Yeah, although it's funny because you would be much more likely to see things that looked like blue jays if you went back in time than you would to see a bat. Bats, I believe bats are part of the great radiation of mammals that occurred after the Cretaceous extinction. There were mammals before the Cretaceous extinction. It's important to remember. But as far as we know, they were mostly quite small. I don't think that the largest mammal that predates the Cretaceous extinction that has ever been found was any bigger than like a beaver.
Really? And that includes that. But what about those giant things that you wrote about that are 10-foot long lawnmowers that were moving across?
Oh, the glyptodons.
The glyptodons.
Yeah, much later that group. It's glyptodons. They're like armored lawnmowers that lived in South America. This is, I realize that we haven't ever said in this conversation when the Cretaceous extinctions were. It was 66 million years ago. That's when that happened. That's when this meteor strikes the Yucatan. And from that time forward, that we said that 30 million years later, Antarctica and South America are finally separated from one another. At that point, South America is like Australia. It's a giant island. It's not connected to North America, and it won't connect to North America until between about 3 and 5 million years ago. So it's this huge sort of other planet unto itself, and the animals that survive there kind of pursue their own evolutionary paths and become this really strange fauna that's unlike anywhere else on Earth. When it connects with North America between 3 and 5 million years ago, the animals from the north and animals from the southern New World meet in this event that one paleontologist called one of the most extraordinary events in the entire history of life. And the animals that come up from the south are very, very weird. They include sloths, anteaters, and armadillos, which are all have a common ancestor. They're sometimes called xenarthrans. And the glyptodonts were one of these. They were like a giant armored armadillo, even more heavily burly armored armadillo that ate plants and just sort of like trundled across the grassland in South America. Some of them even came north. They've been found, our glyptodont shells have been found in Texas. So there was this big exchange of these animals between the Americas that happens at this time.
And how big were they?
Great American Biotic Interchange. How big was a glyptodont?
Yeah.
Well, there have been suggestions that people might have used their shells as shelters every once in a while. I don't think most of them were that big, but let's see.
Okay. Well, a glyptodon, then, if it's a giant armadillo, imagine the size of the pickup truck that would have to have killed that on the side of the road, like an armadillo.
It could leap off the ground, but
but now
in the book we have three animals that walked up from South America into North America that are familiar to us now. One is armadillos, the other is possums, believe it or not, and the other is porcupines. All those are South American animals that have thrived in North America.
Wow.
But a lot of other ones came up too, including giant ground sloths, which no longer exist.
And the giant ground sloths were just that. They were they were like the size of bears.
Yeah, they were as big as bears. They were unbelievably burly. It's funny when you go to like a natural history museum. Often these big mammals, fossil skeletons of these big mammals will be kind of put next to the dinosaur skeletons. And because they're all skeletons, they all sort of look like, you just sort of get them confused in your mind. When you're looking at the dinosaurs, you're looking at things that are 70 million years old or older than that. And if you're looking at these mammals, some of them were, they almost scrape historical time.
Yeah, I mean, they come that close. And you had been in, was it like a secret room at one of those museums? Was it?
Yeah, I wrote a book of it. There is a hidden hall at the American Museum of Natural History. Unfortunately, there's no, it's not a secret meeting room with the Masons or anything like that. It's a bird exhibit about the birds of the Pacific that got hidden behind a butterfly exhibit. And the dioramas have been sitting there in the dark for decades now.
Really?
You can get into them from the back, only from the front. And but I think that is going to finally be restored in the not too distant future.
That's very cool, though. I love that idea. So again, we're talking about birds. One concept for me that that idea of the canary in the coal mine, right? We talk about that there are certain species, and in this case, against the canary's will, but that there are certain species that are vanguard species, that if something happens to this species, then look out, because the rest of the other species may have problems in the years ahead. And we think about birds in that way. Do they actually serve that? They seem to serve that function. It seems like actually it was the other way around, that other species would go down and the birds would survive.
In what scenario?
Well, I just mean we use that term thinking that, like in horror movies, you would see that an indication that something was happening because all the birds are leaving the trees and they're all flying away, and then the next thing you know, something horrible happens, and that we think that that's always the case, that the birds are always here to indicate to us that something is about to happen. But in the canary in the coal mine metaphor, the birds are the first to die, and that gives us the chance to live. But it's really the other way around.
Well, I mean, it depends on which birds you're talking about. There are some birds that thrive around people and some birds that don't. So there are some birds that are really have learned to take advantage of us very well. We tend not to like them very much. Like we generally don't like animals that figure out how to deal with us. But I think it would depend on the species, but I can tell you, though, that radar studies of songbirds, because migrating songbirds appear on weather radars, dating back into the 70s, suggest that there may be as few as half as many songbirds in the continental United States now as there were even a few decades ago. And when you think about like DDT, for instance, which was only approved for commercial use in 1946, DDT, when it accumulated in bird tissues, especially birds that sit right at the top of the food chain, like birds of prey, peregrine falcons, this kind of thing, it caused eggshell thinning in their eggs so that they would crush their eggs as they sat on them, or that the shells wouldn't even develop at all. And their populations plummeted. And it did it so fast that people noticed. I mean, I think about sometimes if DDT had been just a little bit less effective and it had taken longer to do this, we might not have noticed because our generational memories are short. But luckily it happened such that within a single human lifetime, people were able to perceive this difference and they were able to take action, because of things like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, to get DDT out of the environment. And birds in many cases have recovered, like bald eagles, for instance, which suffered terribly during that time.
And this is all in my lifetime, because I remember even as a school child being told DDT was a culprit, and yet it's not worth getting all the mosquitoes and killing all the birds in the process.
No, yeah, I mean, not if you want to have them. I mean, the thing is that humans have so much influence over what kind of world we're going to live in. It's kind of, we wield a terrifying influence over our planet at the moment. And we need to think about how we want to do that, what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of animals we want to live with, what kinds of plants.
Again, we're talking with Jonathan Myberg, and I'll get to your questions and comments coming up at the top of the hour. We'll give you the phone numbers you need to know to join the conversation. A most remarkable creature, the hidden life and epic journey of the world's smartest birds of prey. I would be remiss because G7 kept coming up in the book at the same time that we're talking about the G7 summit. So explain the significance of your G7 in the book.
Well, G7 was a bird that a bandit was working with people who were studying striated caracaras in the fossils on this magical island called Steeple Jason. And G7 was a young bird who one day turned up dead. And we'd seen him just that morning looking fine. In the afternoon, he was dead and half-eaten on the rock. And we were really stumped as to what had killed him. It had killed him in a sort of a strange way, so it had only eaten his pectoral muscles and left the rest of him. And after a while, we figured out that it was probably one of the island's resident peregrine falcons that did him in. A peregrine is actually smaller than a striated caracara, but they're just so efficient and deadly as hunters that we think it might have just gone for them. And that's really interesting to me because they're both falcons. They're members of the same group. So the falcons are a group of birds of prey that I think came up from Antarctica into South America and diversified there. South America is still where you find the greatest diversity and variety of falcon species. So that's another one of the falcons. Some of the falcons made it into the northern world and diversified relatively